Well, it seems to be one of the storylines here is that hope has become the midwife of despair from just a month ago. Look at NVIDIA, which had that warning. The stock went down. Yesterday, they announced this big acquisition, its biggest ever, and the stock actually goes up. Much smaller stock, Stitch Fix, had been hammered ahead of the holiday season. Sure, it's got heavy short interest, but after earnings today, it's up 30%. Plus, at the open, what do you think is happening here with sentiment, particularly in tech, with the markets in general?
Well, as you know, I don't cover any individual stocks, but sentiment's been an interesting force this year, maybe a little bit different than one might have expected, given the carnage that we saw into the Christmas Eve low and then the rally since then. Certain measures of sentiment moved up into extreme optimism territory alongside the rally, but not to broad extremes like what we saw into the September highs of last year. In fact, if you look at a lot of the so-called smart money behavioral measures of sentiment, looking at what those cohorts are actually doing, they've been kind of hanging in there, still betting that this rally has more legs. Normally, when you see the more attitudinal measures of sentiment sort of shoot up into extreme optimism territory, the smart money, from a behavioral perspective, tends to go in the opposite direction. But that hasn't been the case. They're maybe a little bit more cautious, but do still believe maybe there's a little bit more to run here, with a focus back on some of those higher growth, more cyclical areas that led the market into last September's high.
I want to bring in Wedbush's Dan Ives now with us as well. Dan, Apple was an important stock last year, especially given the way it went down on the warning just over the past few weeks. And I wonder, they've got this announcement coming up where a lot of people expect to hear the streaming TV announcement. What do you expect that to do for Apple and for tech in general? Is this a story of more competition or more opportunity across the board?
Look, we think it's a potential game changer, especially, as this has been rumored for many years. I mean, for Apple to get into streaming content, it's significant from the services piece, and that really is ultimately what the key of the valuation for Apple. And I think this is really going to have a ripple effect across the tech food chain, with Apple getting more into content. And I think ultimately for tech to really rise higher, we continue to think it's FANG and Apple. And this, in our opinion, if they're successful, we think 100 million subs they could get in the next 3 years. It's worth about $15 to $20 to the stock. And it's a shot across the bow of Cook to Hastings and others that Apple's here for streaming.
Liz Ann, you've written that the trend is your friend and that you want to stick with technology. I'm wondering, in terms of what you're seeing that could hamper that story, that hamper the story of an uptick in earnings that you see in Q2 and Q3. What we're seeing right now, as you point out in your most recent note, is a low inflation environment, but we are seeing rising wages. And I'm wondering how you see that battle amongst corporations playing out in terms of that rising pressure in terms of their costs, but their inability to actually pass price increases onto consumers. How does that play out for positive earnings in Q2 and Q3?
Well, broadly on earnings, the consensus for first quarter is now down about 2%, and then only back up to about positive 2% for the second and third quarter. And I do think because of the inflection point that we saw last year, courtesy of how the math stops working from a year-over-year perspective relating to tax reform, I think this will be an incredibly important earnings season. Number one, to see if companies can hurdle the bar, but what the guidance looks like as well, because we've already seen a lot of valuation expansion that came courtesy of looser financial conditions, the Fed going in pause mode, and that gave a lift to overall multiples. But I think you're going to have to see better earnings growth for that to persist. As far as the tightness in the labor market, that's extremely important. So far, those increases in wages haven't translated into that wage price spiral that brings on broader measures of inflation. We got a tame CPI report today. But if we continue to see that tightness, given that nominal GDP growth is now above the unemployment rate, that's an environment historically that has kind of kicked back in the Phillips curve. So we may be getting to a point where there's so much tightness in the labor market that it will continue to translate into higher wage growth. And if that starts to filter into broader measures of inflation, I think that represents a risk for the market, especially as it relates to the Fed.
Can we talk a little bit about some of these tech companies moving more and more into the services business? I mean, Dan, at this point, Apple is anticipating this announcement about the streaming service. How important is this for these tech companies to diversify beyond the hardware or the software that landed them in the successful positions they've become anyway?
Yeah, it's really at the epicenter. I mean, if you look what we're seeing more of the growth move to software and services. And, I think, you've seen Microsoft and Nadella look at more services, obviously Apple here. And I think what this really just shows is it's a changing of the guard in technology as more of these traditional tech giants look at software and streaming. In our opinion, it's going to be an influx of M&A. I mean, I think this is really going to be just the tip of the iceberg for a massive M&A cycle that we're going to see with large tech players buying more streaming software content players over the next 2 to 3 years, just given where the spending is. And I think this is something where tech investors right now are really looking to play these trends. And that's why I think Apple, you've seen the stock rebound significantly from the dark lows in early January. As you're starting to see, can you go after that install base? And finally, Cook is going to unveil it.